Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure and honour to have a chance to talk to Don Cupitt. Don, when and where were you born?
I was born in 1934 at what was then called a maternity home in Oldham, Lancashire. My family was of the old Lancashire working class. One grandfather was a plumber and the other was a butcher.
And tell me something about your parents, both what they did and what their character was.
My father was young, short, stocky, dark-haired, the opposite of me physically, quite athletic, but had great driving energy. And even at the age of, at the time when I was born, he was directing large gangs of men, laying gas mains, installing gas lighting and so on, gas heating systems around the country. He was evidently energetic and skilled as a manager, and that's what he became, a businessman, a metal basher. He ran a factory in Brentford, London, and did rather well in the war, working enormously hard, producing the fuselages of warplanes and later landing ships. My mother, whose father was a butcher, worked for Singer sewing machines, but married at the age of 19, and I was born when she was 20. My parents were only 20 years older than I, so they died in the 90s. But after the war, my father was earning quite a good income.
Well, you were talking about which war at this time?
After World War II, sorry. At the end of World War II, my father was earning quite a good income. And rather ambitiously, my parents decided to go in for private education for their 4 children. And by working extraordinarily hard, they put all 4 of us through expensive private schools.
Were you brothers or sisters, did you have?
Yes, I had a brother who became a chemical engineer and 2 sisters who both became doctors. The boys went to Charterhouse and the girls to Cheltenham Ladies' College. So my parents, by their lights, did their best for us, and that was the main work of their lives, I think. They were dedicated to their children, but a bit unhappy in old age, partly because our education inevitably led us a bit away from them, culturally. And also physically, because we went into sort of careers which meant you lived a long way from your own hometown.
Were they, when you say they were from Lancashire, but they went to Brentford?
They moved around the country during the war especially, yes. My father was very busy. Being a sheet metal engineer at that time, he was establishing factories that produced war materials. And one year, he would do this in 6 months or so, train the workers and set it all up, and move on to the next. And we moved house every 6 months during the war. That meant that the early years of the war, we were living near Birmingham during the raids there. In the last years of the war, we were living in West London at the time of the V1s and V2s. So I saw a bit of the war from the point of view of a civilian as I was growing up. I remember actually hearing the first V2 land in Chiswick, lived near there. And I went to a prep school down there, and then on to public school.
Tell me about the prep school. I mean, you went to a number, obviously, if you were moving so much.
Yes, we went to many different schools, yes. A rather ropey little preparatory school down in Gunnersbury, just on the edge of the North Circular Road, by Ealing, a bit south of Ealing Common, near Acton Town Tube Station. Yes. So that's where I was at the age of 12 or so.
Do you remember anything about that school? Were there any good teachers or anything?
The only one I remember was an English teacher, Hugo de Chanchief. He gave me a book called Dodd's Beauties of Shakespeare, which he said was by the only clergyman ever to have been hanged. I was impressed by that. I have the book to this day. It's true, Dodd was the only clergyman of the Church of England ever to be hanged. Otherwise, I remember my mathematics master, Mr. Blake, He lived in Earl's Court in very great poverty, very old man who'd had to return to teaching because of poverty and the war, with the younger teachers having gone off. A lot of older teachers came out of retirement. And I remember him trying to get some maths into my head and having a house in which electric lighting hadn't yet arrived. There was only a little gas lighting overhead. I remember going to his house for extra lessons. Otherwise, there was nobody of note there, whereas, of course, at my older school, the public school, there was a very high-class staff indeed, of notable figures.
Well, let's come to that in a moment. You haven't said much about your mother. What sort of person was she?
She was quiet, very dedicated to her children, good at the old Victorian virtues of make, do and mend. Making clothes, repairing clothes, and she simply toiled away domestically and was devoted to her children. She had only a few friends. In her later years we tried to get her interested in the world, but I think outside a rather narrow family life, she didn't have many interests. It was a trouble to her. She was depressed in her last years. She'd not had enough education. My father had had at least night school and his work to educate him. My mother hadn't had that. It was an age when a lot of ordinary folk had good genes but poor educational opportunities.
Did either, we're going to come to religion fairly soon, but did either of them have an interest in religion?
No. No, my family was secular and I had no religious upbringing from them. The only near religious influence was that of my grandmother. My grandmother, Emma Cupitt, E.H. Cupitt, had got a scholarship as a girl to go to medical school from a poor family in Nottingham. The family wouldn't allow her to go because she was the oldest of 12 children and she had to stay home and help her mother to raise them. So all her life she was drastically undereducated and frustrated about it. And she took up instead palmistry, tea leaves, divination from dreams, theosophy, and all sorts of more or less occult kinds of knowledge. And I remember her taking me to a spiritualist meeting once. So perhaps some interest in religion and a rather critical attitude to it owes something to her. The sense that religion provided a sort of knowledge for people who haven't had the opportunity to encounter real knowledge.
Did you go to table tapping and
I never attended a true seance, no.
No.
But I do remember the spiritualist meetings at which a medium would get up and claim after a while to be hearing voices coming through, and it was a man, he had a dog, he had a pipe, and very soon somebody would say, "That's my Herbert." And he would sort of go on, apparently giving information from the other side. And to me, at the age of 10 or so, it was obvious that this was a bit of a con in which everybody was complicit, including the medium himself. He was half taken in by his own line of patter. So my religious scepticism perhaps owes something to that early influence.
did you have any particular hobbies or interests at that time?
All my life I've had a succession of fads and crazes, and I've picked up a lot of my general education simply by having been very keen on a subject for a short period. An early one, for example, was butterflies. I collected them. I'm still a member of butterfly conservation to this day. It was one of the means by which I got into natural history, and birds I became keen on too. Or I became very keen on Italian opera, assembled a large collection of pre-electric gramophone records, and by that way learnt something about music, and even at Charterhouse got a master to teach me Italian.
So when did your interest in Italian opera start? What age were you?
12 or so.
Really? Gosh.
Yes. I remember before I was 13, I had read all Dickens too. I was a voracious reader from an early age. I used to haunt second-hand bookshops and bring home sixpenny copies of Victorian novels and such like things. I certainly had virtually the whole of everyone's library as a very small boy. So I was a furious reader from early on. I should think until I was 30 I probably read a novel a day, in addition to academic reading.
Good heavens.
So
You were a very fast reader.
yes, but now I don't read novels. But in those days, I was a very rapid, voracious reader. Yes, and I remember reading rapidly through things like Proust and the lot, and learning a lot from it is the best way to learn language and writing, just by massive amounts of reading. We were lucky in that way. I think it was a better education than the modern child's equivalent thing, which is having a really thorough knowledge of cinema. I've only got interested in cinema late in life. In my generation, television hadn't yet arrived, and it was the novel through which you basically learnt about the world.
Did your parents encourage you in this reading?
No, I just did it.
And your sisters and brothers as well, or not? Did they
The
read?
two sisters became quite senior doctors with good ability. My brother was, intelligent, but I wouldn't describe any of them as intellectuals and none of them publishers, but they've had their careers and so on. But I was rather exceptional, I suppose, in being rather reflective and having a huge appetite for language and for the various fads and crazes I took up. I remember another one, architecture, which really started at school, where I think my housemaster encouraged that by taking me church crawling.
This is at Charterhouse.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But I've always been a Pevsnerite and I've had the latest volumes of the whole series as they've come out, as it were. And I've always liked architecture and taken a pride in being able to read a city historically. Only very much more recently I learned from Hoskins and Oliver Rackham to read landscape in the same way.
So let's now move on to Charterhouse. Tell me about your school days. Were they pleasant or miserable, or
On the whole,
were you a
happy.
boarder, by the way? Or
Yes,
no?
I was a boarder. I won a foundation scholarship which helped pay the fees. It was in those days a large chunk of the fees. And I remember the names of some of the other scholars. They include some other people who became philosophers as well, including Geoffrey Lloyd of this college.
Oh, really?
And
I've interviewed
Richard
Geoffrey.
Sarabji, Richard Swinburne, but people who became known as philosophers. Yes. I started reading general subjects and did 8 A-levels and then switched to science at A-level. There were some excellent people amongst the masters who did influence me. But I also
Do you
did
want to
become
name any
aware
of
of
them?
religion and religious thought at school.
Can you name any of the teachers? So do you remember any
Of
of
the
them?
well-known ones,
All
whom
right.
I saw a lot of, Richard Palunin, the botanist, a very eminent field botanist who wrote most of the standard books about the Himalayan flora. Wilfred Noyce, the poet mountaineer, who died in the Himalayas and taught me Italian. Percy Chapman taught me zoology. Bob Arrowsmith was my housemaster, a well-known, slightly eccentric schoolmaster, but very good on architecture. But there were many talented and interesting characters. English I was taught by W.C. Seller, famous as the author of a book called 1066 and all that.
Yes,
And I remember the way he talked about Browning to this day. And I still love Browning. Yes. The upper middle class world of school was strange to me at first, but I took to it culturally, and you couldn't but admire and respect the masters. They were very high class people, even if many of the boys were from very class conscious, well to do Surrey families who would not normally be my first choice of company.
Were you bullied at all, or?
No, no. I was always physically large and able to hold my own, I suppose. Not particularly combative, but if I had the relics of a North Country accent, I no doubt lost it very quickly. I didn't even remember it being a problem.
And were you a games player?
Only moderate. I think the only thing on which I captained the school was chess. But I was moderately good at soccer and at cross-country running. That's all. Coming up to school to read, to take my scholarship examinations in June 47, I strayed out onto the cricket pitch, and there I saw PBH May make 180 odd runs against Eton on the school cricket field. And that was the most physically beautiful display of sport I've ever seen by anybody, because young May was a prodigious cricketer. That's the only really remarkable sporting memory I've got. But the beauty of his stroke plays was extraordinary. He became captain of England subsequently without having had a terrifically distinguished career, but as a young man he was tremendous. Of course, the school in those days did have high-class professionals. For example, the cricket professional was an England spin bowler called George Geary from the 1930s. But I was no good at cricket. I quite liked football.
And what about music at this stage? Did you continue?
No, oddly enough, I never had a decent musical education. I've regretted it ever since. So I picked up a little on my own, but never learned to sing properly or to read music properly. So or to play an instrument.
But has music been important to you in your life?
Not a major thing, no. I'm predominantly a verbal person. I'm an articulator, as it were, I think. A few years ago it seemed quite likely that my sight was deteriorating very badly and I would have to take up music and listen to it more. But just recently, surgery has improved my eyesight and I've had good news about it. So I expect I'll stick to the word from now on. And with luck my eyes will last me out. If they start to go really badly, I will have to have a music craze. The last music craze I had was for modern music. 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I remember I did, for a year or two, buy a lot of modern music and listen to it. Then it was Stravinsky and after, including a lot of modern minimalism and stuff like that.
Were there, you mentioned your crazes before, were there any other hobbies you were you still continuing with your collecting of butterflies or natural
Railway
history?
engines, books, yes, and railway engines was another craze that all small boys had, but that was from an earlier age, between about the ages of 8 and 11. I joined those small boys who knew their way through holes in the fence into every engine shed in London and were chased out by railwaymen from all these places. Nine Elms, Neasden. I remember to this day the names of the great London engine sheds where enthusiastic small boys used to go carrying their copies of Ian Allen's guides to the rolling stock of the great railway companies. You ticked every engine off as you'd seen it. Yes, railway engines were an early example of a craze, and from that getting interested in Victorian engineering, the heroic age of British industry. A love of bridges and Brunel and such things.
What about things like drama and debating?
I was not a performer as a boy, I don't think, so far as I remember. If I developed any ability to perform publicly, it was much later in life. I was probably too shy when young. I don't remember ever doing much in that line, no. I was head of my house, eventually the school monitor, and was seen when young as a potential leader, as long as I was respectable. Other people saw me as a leader, but that's all I remember. To go forward a little bit until after school, as a national serviceman, I was best cadet of my year, despite being really not at all military. But I did have the air of a leader when young, and I was no doubt expected to be a church leader at one time, before it became clear that I was a baddie. So that's perhaps where my talent was felt to lie. That's why I became so easily assimilated into a higher class than I'd been born into. It was felt that that was where I was naturally heading.
What were your political views then? Do you remember at all?
When I first became very strongly Christian and practicing after my confirmation, I saw myself as a liberal Anglican Tory, a bit in the Harold Macmillan or Rab Butler style, I think. I only became aware of being more socialist, I would think, in my 20s. I think when young I was attracted to readers and writers like Britton and Eliot and C.S. Lewis, those after World War II who still hoped it might be possible to reconstruct Christian Europe, so that I was only a Tory in the sense that people on the continent were Christian Democrats. We wanted to reconstruct Christian civilization because we looked at fascism and at communism. We didn't want either of those. And you probably remember exactly the same way, that in the 50s, many of us felt in the West it ought to be possible to rebuild a Christian society in England.
Well, you mentioned there after your confirmation. What age were you when you were confirmed?
15.
And it was after confirmation rather than before that you became...
After confirmation I became a weekly communicant and sometimes went once during the week as well in the old chapel at Charterhouse, I remember. I was pretty devout around the ages of 15, 16. Then when I did a lot of Darwin and zoology, I drifted away from it and then returned to religion very sharply at 18 at Cambridge. So much of my time at school I was very interested in religion and in religious thought. The two great influences were Plato and Darwin. I met Plato's Republic by reading it aloud with the headmaster in his study with the other school monitors. It was our induction into being leaders, Platonic guardians. And I met Darwin through doing zoology. So Plato's top-down vision of the universe and Darwin's British empiricist bottom-up vision of the universe were in conflict within my mind from the age of 16, 17 onwards. So I knew that I was very religious by the time I was 15, 16. I also knew that religious thought was going to trouble me within a year or two.
Did you ever go to religious camps or anything at that age?
Not at that age, not until I got to Cambridge. No, I wasn't touched by evangelical, twice-born Christianity until I came up to Cambridge.
And did you, at school, have any spiritual experiences? I mean,
Yes, I've all my life been liable to religious experiences. I think caused by a kind of overspill of joy, often associated with a sense of sight and sunshine, brilliant light. So I've always had religious experience. When I was first converted, I remember what I took then to be an experience of God was a feeling of almost continuous warmth, curious sensation, which the mystics often report. They link it with actual dilation of the capillaries, of course. If you're a Tibetan lama, one of your practical exams consists of drying out a damp sheet with your skin, because you can meditate to the point when your capillaries dilate, your skin gets warm. So your practical exam consists of drying out a sheet. But I knew what it was like to feel a sense of religious exaltation that made one physically warm. I'm trying to think of school religious experiences. I remember the feelings were very strong. The earliest religious experience I actually put in my books were ones I had as an undergraduate in Cambridge. But as I say, they were usually extravertive and visual. Extravertive in the sense it was that looking at something outside of myself and seeing it as being as brilliant as a painting by Vincent van Gogh. A sort of super real, super vivid sense of colour and of the brilliance of the world. In some recent books I call that brightness. The brilliance of the fact that our visual experience is more conscious than our other sensations. When visual experience is at its most highly conscious, in fine weather, good eyesight, the world takes on a kind of glory. Now I think of it, a lot of English poets describe it, don't they? Traherne, Wordsworth, those sort of people.
and Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Yes, yes.
Glory be to God.
Experiences like, yes, that's right. It's experiences like that that have been my most common religious experiences. And I still have that. I still have experiences of something like Protestant joy, when the feeling of God's grace boils over in one's soul I feel an extraordinary sense of exaltation. It's often associated with Methodist hymns, isn't it? And with ritual poems about tabernacles and glory. But I've known that, and I think it's an extinct kind of religious experience now, but I knew it when I was young.
Let's just finish on Charterhouse.
Yeah.
You said you started specialising in science,
Yes.
so you took A levels or something?
A-levels, botany, zoology, organic chemistry.
Mm.
Yes, yes.
And from there, did you try different universities or?
No, the school recommended me to try Trinity Hall, Cambridge,
Mm.
and I got an exhibition only at Trinity Hall, to my disappointment, and came up in 1952. But the exhibition was worth £100 or something, which in those days was a significant chunk of the fees, so it probably helped my parents, and they were very pleased about it. Yes. In those days, Cambridge was simpler and less congested than now, and I do remember that every term my father delivered me by car to Trinity Hall Porter's Lodge, and unloaded the suitcase and drove his car out again. You couldn't get anywhere near my car nowadays, but that was the old modern Cambridge. Today's Cambridge is postmodern. It's Cambridge as the film industry would like to see it. But in those days, buses clanked in both directions down Trinity Street, which was tarmac, not cobbled. You know, today's Cambridge is a fake postmodern Cambridge as the media like to think of Cambridge as looking. But in those days it was real Cambridge with sooty buildings, and you could drive anywhere and cycle anywhere, and we did.
Do you remember the atmosphere when you came to Cambridge? I mean,
intellectual exhilaration, of course, and great freedom after school, where you were under discipline, had stricter timetable. There was the great freedom of Cambridge, so to someone like me from a modest background, it was exciting, visually because of the beauty of the buildings, but above all intellectually because of the huge range of interesting people who were in all directions. So it was thrilling, and I still say, I used to say that Cambridge was the best youth club in the world. Now I say that in many ways it's the best day centre for the elderly, because I'm a life fellow of my college. Somehow Cambridge College manages to do both a superb youth club and a superb day centre for the elderly. So it's an environment I've enjoyed so much that I've really wanted to stay, I think.
And what was Trinity Hall like? Who was the master? Do you remember?
Yes, a rather scandalous old bird called Daddy Dean, a professor of physiology, was it, or anatomy? One of the medical subjects. One of the very last professors to be appointed before the retiring age came in. He was already in his 80s. Don't you remember? He used to say, "I'm already out of date, soon I'll be a scandal, and I pray God I may live to be an outrage." And he did, more or less. But he lived till almost the end of his 80s. And by then, of course, the university was seeing a retiring age as inevitable. The best known of the fellows was Owen Chadwick, who was my supervisor when I changed to theology. He was the dean of the college. Yes.
Because I've interviewed him.
Yes.
What was he like as a supervisor?
Quiet, conscientious, and a good teacher. Very hard-working and serious-minded in his way. Amongst undergraduates, it was believed that he had a riotous past when he had been a considerable rugby player. But when I came up as an undergraduate, Owen was already in his mid-30s, sobering down, and everybody said he was going to be at least Archbishop of Canterbury, and probably something much more important than that. Amongst the fellows, Louis Clark of the Fitzwilliam Museum, Ronald Fisher, the celebrated biologist.
Who you were talking about, he helped establish, was that R.A. Fisher?
R.A. Fisher. I think the book's called The Mathematical Theory of Natural Selection, 1927. It's the book that saved Darwinism at a time when its intellectual prestige was rather low, because no answer had been found yet to the question of how mutations, which are recessive, could ever spread through a whole population. because surely out of every 4 children, only one would show an advantageous mutation, at most. But Fisher did the mathematics of natural selection, and then people following in his footsteps have demonstrated by looking at big seabird populations, where you could chronicle every bird, have shown how it works out. But Sir Fisher was a considerable biologist. Of the other fellows, I remember Tony Tremlett, the chaplain, my director of studies, George Kenner, as a scientist. Kenner had a big influence on me because he suggested that in my second year of Natural Sciences Part 1, I should do the history and philosophy of science, which had just then begun as a Cambridge subject. And I did that, and that had a big influence on me because it returned me to philosophy and to seeing ideas as having a history. No, the lecturer in the history of science was Rupert Hall, who lectured on the 17th century and on the 19th century, really. And the philosopher of science was Russ Hanson, who looked like young Orson Welles. He was a young American who had listened to Wittgenstein, and a rather distinguished and promising young philosopher of science. Unhappily, he died prematurely and tragically in a plane accident back in America, where he went off to a chair, without ever fulfilling his promise. But I did learn a lot from Russ Hanson, because he introduced me to Wittgenstein's ideas and to the way I would come eventually to think in philosophy in 1953, when I was still barely 20.
And you said that you also came to supervisions with zoologists in King's.
Yes, Clive Parry, who I think may have been deputy provost or something. In
Donald Parry.
Donald Parry. Donald
Yes.
Parry.
Yeah.
In this building, the Gibbs building in King's, yes. My botany supervisor, I remember, was John Scott was the name, but I also met Max Waters and Anna Bidder. In organic chemistry, a chap called Saunders and Maudlin, BC Saunders. In the history and philosophy of science, Hall and Hanson. I well remember going to philosophy of science supervisions with Hanson, which were very exciting. He lived in those days just in a bed-sitter in Parsons Court or somewhere. Cambridge was so short of accommodation. And underneath his bed was a large wooden box. One day he pulled it out, and it was full of brass scientific instruments. This was the Whipple collection. This was the beginnings of the Whipple Museum of the History of Science, which now occupies 3 or 4 big rooms in Free School Lane. But in those days it was just Russ Hanson looking after a box of bits and pieces. But we got them out and talked about them, and he was a delightful man, and I was very, very sorry to hear about his premature death. The one book he did publish was Patterns of Discovery, but one of the things he picked up from Wittgenstein, of course, was that seeing is already interpreting. To see something is to interpret it. That was leading away from pure empiricism. The eye doesn't just photograph the world, the eye interprets the world. We see something as something. And I got interested through that, through him, in language and in interpretation and in the sort of post-empiricist kind of philosophy. I also learned, by the way, that science is a cultural activity and it has a history. A lot of scientists seem to think that scientific truth exists in a kind of sacred Platonic world of its own, untouched by time and human interests and so on. Of course that's not so. Scientific ideas reflect the society that produces them, and they have a certain lifespan, after which they're no longer useful and are superseded by other ideas. So reading the history and philosophy of science was a very useful transitional subject when I turned to theology.
Well, that leads to, you alluded before that it was at Cambridge that your interest in religion revived.
Yes.
And evangelical Christianity.
Yes, I became an evangelical in my first term, at the end of term, and was caught up with them for about a year, Then I drifted away and went first rather liberal, then rather Anglo-Catholic.
Who among the evangelicals caught your attention? Was it a particular preacher or person?
Why I was converted, I don't know. In retrospect, I supposed that in my first few weeks in Cambridge, I was lonely and a bit vulnerable, and was taken along to the usual evangelical sermon on Sunday evenings in Holy Trinity Church, and was converted on the spot, and joined the evangelical group in college.
Does this kick you?
Yes. I began to feel they were too narrow almost immediately, and by the end of my first year I'd broken away from them and begun theological reading on my own. By the end of my second year I knew I wanted to be ordained, and was reading rather widely in theology and drifting away from science. So that was it. Yes, it was rather surprising that the evangelicals should have been the means of reviving my concern for religion. But it's often said that British theologians are, on the whole, evangelicals trying to work their way out of it without going completely potty. That may be true. It's been a bit of a blight on the history of Cambridge, and to some extent Oxford as well, that this has been such a prominent feature of the undergraduate religious scene for over 100 years.
Does it start, I mean, the late 19th century, I've forgotten the very famous Cambridge
William Sankey conducted an evangelical mission in Cambridge in the early 90s, and from that the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union grew. In my undergraduate days, much of the university was very religious. The leader of KICU, its guru, was Basil Atkinson, an under-librarian at the university library, and he was the real organiser of them. He was rather like a Victorian Calvinist. It was a rather grim, puritanical kind of religion, but worst of all, it was totally anti-rational, as it still is to this day. Amazingly irrational. And I quickly found it rather horrifying. I simply could not make sense of the language you were required to use.
I remember the name of the person, Simeon, Charles Simeon.
Charles Simeon, yes.
Was he an evangelical?
Yes, there was a version of evangelicalism in Cambridge in the early 19th century. This is long before. Deriving from the evangelical revival out of which the Wesleys came in the early 18th century. And it's the equivalent of what on the continent is called pietism, with an emphasis on personal experience and holiness of your personal life. In London, the Clapham sect evangelicals, of whom Wilberforce was a member, were very influential, doing good works, and you can't really call them irrational, because they had a big influence on social ethics in the early 19th century.
As did Clarkson at Cambridge.
Yes, of course, Clarkson, a very great man, yes. Well, Charles Simeon was Vicar of Holy Trinity. There was that tradition of Cambridge evangelicalism, but it got its rather oppressive quality from the Americans, and the very, very strong emphasis on conversion, and the belief that having become converted, you became an instant expert on everything. You now had the true godly point of view on all matters.
And before that, there'd also been a strong evangelical missionizing.
Yes.
Because the Church Missionary Society and so on were.
Yes, well, that's probably true. And as a lot of schools had East End missions, and now I think of it, while at Charterhouse, I visited Charterhouse in Bermondsey, which was a school mission to the East End. This was almost a class mission. Boys of the well-to-do privileged classes went to take kids from the slums on camps and so on. It was meant to be some sort of religious content too, but yes, rather well-meaning, but fairly harmless, these missions were. There was Cambridge House in London too, wasn't there? Yes. As an undergraduate, I remember going once on a hopping mission to Kent, where Cambridge undergraduates lived alongside hop pickers in the fields, and supposedly talked to them about religion. Yes. I came eventually to see that as really inspired by class fees, being rather absurd, and not something I wanted myself to be involved in. But,
were you put through this? I mean, I went through all this as well,
Yeah.
for Doikyu and so on.
Yeah.
They were constantly asking you to let God into your life. You know,
Yes.
he was knocking on your
Yes.
heart, and
Yes.
and you were to open the door and let him in, and then there'd be a moment when you felt him
That's
inside
right.
you.
That's right. Yes, this had a sort of intellectually respectable origin. In the 1740s, when early British imperialism, especially in the sciences, was at its height, there was a desire to show that religious beliefs could similarly be verified in personal experience. And that influenced the evangelical tradition in theology. It was claimed that you could have personal experiences that in detail verified your approximately Calvinist religious beliefs. That was the sort of respectable origin. It was a desire to claim that religious experience could verify religious beliefs. Not true now, I think, obviously. By the 60s, certainly, people began to publish books saying that your religious beliefs shape the kind of experiences you have. And therefore, of course, your religious experiences verify your religious beliefs. Rather as, if somebody has a vision of the Virgin Mary, you can be pretty certain that that somebody is an adolescent Catholic girl and not a Muslim or a Chinese or something. You know, people have the beliefs that have the experiences that their religion leads them to have. And when people have a vision of the Virgin Mary, if you ask the girl in question, how did you know it was the Virgin Mary? And she would answer, well, she had on a blue cloak and a red gown, as she does in church in the statues. Well, of course. Belief shapes experience. I'd come to see that myself by the 50s, really, and was unpersuaded by the argument. But that is why such rationale as evangelicalism could claim had that origin. Taste and see, or whatever it is, how gracious the Lord is. Experience will decide how blessed are they, and only they who in his truth confide. Remember the hymn?
Yeah.
There was that appeal to experience in an 18th century hymn. But of course, today's evangelicalism, as promoted by Holy Trinity Church Brompton, isn't even that rational. It is hopeless, but very popular still.
Well, it seems particularly interesting that you were at Cambridge, which
Yes.
is associated with Darwin. You were doing natural science and
Yes,
interested in biology,
yes,
and Darwin had been one of your great heroes,
yes.
and yet you were thinking of becoming ordained. Did you not
Yes.
feel any conflict at that time?
The interest in religion was just stronger. It's true, I shared my rooms as an undergraduate for 3 years with Neil Alexander, who became a celebrated professor of zoology at Leeds. I knew Jonathan Miller well, who became a doctor, and then, of course, a comedian and so on. And I knew Francis Darwin, a great-grandson. Yes, I had a lot of friends in the sciences. So why did I go for ordination? Well, I suppose my religious thought and feeling was so strong at that age that ordination was what I wanted to do. I wanted to study theology. I had, just off my own bat, got interested in a bit in Anglo-Catholic writing, a bit in Dean Ing and liberal Platonic Protestant writing, and quite a lot in the mystics. I was already reading the standard mystical writers you'd expect me to be able to pick up, and getting interested in mysticism.
Is this the Spanish or the English or the Italian?
Yes, English people, The Cloud of Unknowing, Mother Julian, Marjorie Kemp, Walter Hilton.
So they are English mainly.
But also St John the Cross and St Teresa of Avila, and one or two Germans, well, the most important of whom was Eckhart. Yes. Weisbrot. Those were quite a lot read in those days, but I did learn something from them, and I got a little bit of philosophy, Christian Platonism, from studying them. Yes. And this was my own spare time, amateur reading, while I was still trying to do adequately in science. Yes.
And how did you end up in science? Did you?
Lousy, got a 2-2.
Did you?
Terrible. Yes, yes, yes. I suppose really I'd given up doing it. By that time, I wanted to do theology.
Did you? You mentioned one or two of your contemporaries. Was Jonathan Miller your exact contemporary, or just a little?
I remember him well, young and red-haired, gawky and looking a little bit like me, curiously.
So this was the great time of drama in Cambridge too?
Yes,
Footlights.
yes. They didn't know any of those people at all. It's funny. But they operated in an English faculty for the world that wasn't our concern.
Was Raymond Williams?
I knew everybody in the college. You know how intensely sociable Cambridge was in those days. I do remember that in my second year, I knew every other undergraduate in the college. And it was we were very tightly sociable, and we never let a cup of tea pass without sharing it with somebody. Yes, but I didn't know the coming celebrities of the Footlights and so on. No. The only one I met was Jonathan Miller, because he'd been at the same school as my roommate.
So having got a 2-2, you weren't going to go on and do research in natural science?
No, 2-2 in part 1.
Part 1?
Yes, you see. And then I changed to theology.
It's a 2-year part 1?
Yes.
Yeah.
I just did the 2-year part 1.
I see. And then you changed to theology?
Yes.
And who influenced you there?
Owen Chadwick was my director of studies now, and taught me 19th century church history and was encouraging. George Woods taught me the philosophy of religion. He was dean at Downing. He was a moderate English philosopher of religion in approximately the tradition of William Paley and Bishop Butler. I am a Cambridge latitudinarian, he said to me, which he was. Old Testament, New Testament, early church history, fairly routine stuff, but I read it eagerly. The Part 1A syllabus was very demanding. You were doing almost the whole of Part 2, certainly 5 papers, 5 substantial papers. But I enjoyed doing it. I perhaps crammed too hard and worked too hard, but I enjoyed doing it.
What about the beauty of holiness? Were you going to King's and other chapels? Or?
Yes, I attended King's most weekdays at 5:30, evensong. My room was on the corner, and I saw the chapel and heard it from my rooms in Trinity Hall at the front, looking out to the little street. So I was very frequently in King's and in Trinity Hall Chapel. So I was very churchy, very absorbed in religion as an undergraduate, I suppose. Yes.
What about women?
No, somehow I wasn't ready yet. And some chaps were notoriously good at girls, and you could always meet Girtonians by getting to their rooms. I remember one friend of mine somehow made friends with women, great numbers, very easily. And his room's always full of girls from Girton. So that was where you went to meet girls from Girton. And a few of those I remained in touch with for many years, but I didn't actually have any regular relationship with any particular young woman at that age, no. Perhaps I just wasn't ready for it. Perhaps my own mental development was all-absorbing, really. I was preoccupied with that. George Woods once took me aside and said, "Remember not to allow them to keep you so busy that you forget to get around to getting married." I much regret that I never did. And it was good advice from George, that he felt that being ordained and then becoming a Cambridge Don and a lecturer and the very heavy pastoral responsibilities in the college meant that you worked 7 days a week and there was always work to do, and somehow you never got round to getting married. So George was warning me that I mustn't make that mistake.
Advice you took, I hope?
Of course, yes.
Yes, we'll come to you.
But not till 29, some years later.
Right, well, you finished your part, you did a part 1A.
Part 1A theology, yes, yes. Again, I did very badly. I got to 2-1, and not at first. But Owen Chadwick encouraged me and said he thought I might have a future in theology. And then I also got a place at Westcott House to be trained for the ministry. But before that, I had at last to do my military service. I was 21, just graduated, with what the army saw as a science degree. So within days of my getting my degree, I was required to present myself at Catholic camp and join the Royal Signals.
Catterick?
In Richmond, North
Oh yes,
Yorkshire.
yes, yes. I thought I
Yes.
heard it right.
Yeah.
Was that a sobering experience, or?
Not too bad. Having been at boarding school and so on, the hardship of the army wasn't all that strange.
Mm-hmm.
I had been at a very expensive boarding school which had no central heating. And you got up and washed in cold water in the depth of winter. You were required to have your window open at night, and at boarding school I remember the frost on one's blankets in the morning. So the hardships of boarding school and its discipline made the army seem quite easy. And curiously, public school boys like me found basic training in the army less harsh and alarming than the ordinary kids from cities in the north who had never been away from their mums before. For them it must have been a terrible ordeal. Some of them sobbed themselves to sleep at night. We could take it easily. We knew about this kind of thing. Our parents had paid for us to have a bad time. I remember being pretty depressed some mornings at Catholic saying, I've got to do 2 years of this. I'm so busy, I've got so much I want to do. The idea of losing 2 years of one's life, perhaps quite unnecessarily, was depressing, but one had to do it in those days. The whole culture was much more militarized than people can imagine nowadays. You grew up in a war memorial chapel, in institutions which have seen whole generations of kids sacrificed to the war, believing that it was a good and sweet thing to die for your country, and you might be called upon to do it, to an extent which nowadays people have no idea of. We now live in a civilian culture, and the old military values mean nothing anymore.
You sound regretful about this.
No, I wasn't quite pacifism. I was fairly near to it. I hated military service, really. I was able to profit a little from it, but I suppose I did believe that the Second World War had been a just cause. I suppose all my life I thought the First World War was a catastrophe. It should never have happened, and we were as much at fault as anyone else. Whereas the Second World War was a war that had to be fought. It was necessary to defeat fascism in Europe. But the colonial stuff that followed, and the gradual rundown of the British Empire, was a pretty untidy business. I got sent out to Cyprus, but I was able to take along with me a lot of philosophy books, and I managed to keep up reading throughout the period of military service, particularly in philosophy.
It's odd, because I think this is what Geoffrey Lloyd did, who you mentioned.
Yes.
He went to Cyprus, I think, possibly.
Yes, yes.
And he took out quite a lot of books.
Such as you could pack in with your troops' stores. That's what I did. They were in a box labelled essential equipment or something. I managed to take out 50 or 60 philosophy books, including the whole of the Penguin philosophy series, remember, that came out in the 50s. So I read those and got a basic knowledge of the history of philosophy firmly in my head by reading and rereading these wretched books while sitting in ridiculously hot conditions in Cyprus. But the army was quite kind in its way. I passed out of officer training with credit.
Top cadet, you said.
Top cadet. I even won heavyweight boxing. But that was only because my opponent scratched. He'd injured himself or something. He was a terrible slogger. But, anyway, I survived Cyprus and look forward to getting back to Cambridge after being demobbed in '57. We were one of the last generations to do it. I've talked with Bruce Kent, I think he was 1-2 years later than I, about his experience of the same thing, of having to do national service in the days when the empire was being wound down rather quickly. I coincided with the Suez invasion, of course. My signal troop was attached to a gunner regiment which was sent out to Cyprus to relieve commandos who went into Suez. What a waste of time that was.
Do you remember what your feelings about Suez were at the time?
Little bit of alarm. I remember the fear of nuclear war for a few days at that time, when Khrushchev was making very threatening noises, the Americans flatly refused to support Eden and the French. And it became clear that we were in trouble and on our own. The Americans were not protected. They thought the whole adventure was misconceived, which it was. It was a catastrophic mistake. I suppose it was a bit of a disaster for the old Conservative Party and its values, the whole thing. You could no longer believe in their wisdom if they could make such a dreadful mistake. Anthony Eden had been the coming man of British politics, the darling of the English middle classes. He waited decades to become leader of the Tory party and Prime Minister, and then he made such a hash of it. I won't think of any contemporary echoes of that, but it was a catastrophe at the time for him and for everyone.
So let's bring you back to Cambridge and Westcott House. What was that a good experience?
Yes, I was sent back to Trinity Hall for my studies to do part 3 in the philosophy of religion. And this was a postgraduate qualification in those days. For that I returned to George Woods. So my first year was spent mainly on working very hard at the philosophy of religion. And in that at last I got a decent first. At last. And then people began to say to me, you're probably pressed to take an undergraduate, an academic career. But the principal of Westcott House also asked me to promise to be vice principal there when called upon.
Who was the principal?
Kenneth Carey, of an old Victorian family, who became Bishop of Edinburgh. The vice principal was John Habgood, who became Archbishop of York. The previous vice principal was Bob Runcie, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. It was in those days a strong liberal Anglican, slightly high, but basically liberal Anglican college with rather high-class student intake, good people, and rather nice. It had been a bit left-wing in the 1930s. A little anecdote from the 30s relates that Joe Needham, a celebrated biochemist, communist, and sinologist, was one of those who went on a coach every Sunday morning from Westcott House down to Thaxted, where the celebrated communist Conrad Noel was the vicar. The great English stronghold of communist Anglo-Catholicism. A lot of Westcott House people were keen on that. They organised a coach down there. I suppose these were people who could still see in communism a little bit of the kingdom of God on earth, and who wanted to change English society and to break completely with the old pre-war class society and make a new and better England. And they were genuine patriots and quite Tory-ish in some ways, but they changed their Victorian neo-medievalism into a modern Christian socialism. And it wasn't such a big shift as you may imagine.
And where did the famous Cambridge spies fit into all this?
None of them were connected with the church, no.
Because they were also, to a certain extent, idealists who had been...
Yes, I think that was so, yes. If you think of William Morris, there were connections between Victorian medievalism and socialism. People often forget that, yes. But Ruskin and Morris and those people were like that. Nowadays, there's much indignation that Cambridge chaps could have got mixed up in such dreadful things, but it didn't seem like that at the time. Victorian social concern morphed over the generations into sympathy for far-left ideas about rebuilding society. Perhaps I was turned in a socialist direction a little bit myself while at Westcott House. No longer Tories, rather we believed in the welfare state and things like that. Of course we did.
You were talking about the welfare state and how what an important moment it was when Bevan introduced that.
Yes, I noticed, living through that Attlee government in the years after the war, I noticed the hatred of the Conservative press for the Attlee government and its achievements, but also the stupendous achievement of men like Naren Bevan, who in 6 months, in the teeth of fierce opposition from the medical profession, from hospital boards, from the press, from the Tory party and so on, managed to get the National Health Service established, and within 2 or 3 years saw a spectacular improvement in public health for the population. It was a stupendous achievement. This made one believe that social reform really could transform society. It's hard to remember now that you can't make a film about the Second World War using original uniforms, because people are a size bigger now than they were then. The health and appearance of the population has changed completely since the 40s. That's been a marvellous achievement. So we really believed that Christian ethics could build a better society, and the Labour Party was the right vehicle for it. Another example of this was my friend Ralph Lapwood, a fellow of Emmanuel, who was with Chairman Mao on the Long March and was also a perfectly straightforward English Free Churchman and a good mathematician, academic mathematician. He reminded one of the ease with which a well-intentioned person of that period could combine communism with Christianity. Of course, why not? We took both seriously as projects for making a better world. So the profound disillusionment with communism and even Maoism as well that occurred during the 60s has coloured our recollection of the earlier period when you could see at its best in socialism a project for realising Christian gospel on earth.
One thought before we pass on over Westcott House onwards. Were you at all influenced, I think you mentioned C.S. Lewis, but the whole sort of Oxford, although he came to Cambridge, school of, Charles Williams, Dorothy Sayers, Tolkien, Lewis, did they at any time interest you a lot, or did you meet any of them?
I read them all. I met Lewis 2 or 3 times. I didn't greatly like the views of them, though, after a short while, as I began to study theology. It occurred to me they hadn't really assimilated the philosophies I liked most, and they hadn't really assimilated biblical criticism. Their Christianity was of a rather neo-orthodox kind that didn't attract me. It wasn't critical enough. In philosophy at this time, I was coming to be deeply influenced by Kant and Kierkegaard, and I wanted to...
And Hume?
And Hume, yes. Hume, because he was the set topic for the part 3, I think of it, and Kant and Kierkegaard. And that affected me like this, that I had been very keen on mysticism. I knew about the negative way in mysticism by giving up the images, and I tended to see critical thinking in religion as a matter of refining, purifying, emptying out, giving up inadequate, merely human images. So my religion was getting rather austere and abstract at that stage. I liked a very high orthodox theism. I didn't like any kind of religious wish fulfillment or anthropomorphism. I wanted a rather dry mysticism, and I greatly admired the painting of people like Mark Rothko, Jews who similarly were religious minimalists. You could say I reached my very radical views in religion by pushing high orthodoxy even higher, to the point where God became an abstract ideal rather than a person. But in that, I was very different from C.S. Lewis and his generation. They had a literary and aesthetic attitude to religion. They liked what Lewis called thick religion, with as much blood, mythology and symbolism as possible. Yeah, like Geoffrey Hill. It just occurred to me. Geoffrey thought there couldn't be any true religion without lots of That's in one of his early poems, isn't it?
Mm.
There is no bloodless myth can save, if I remember the line.
And
Yeah.
you believed in thin religion.
I like thin religion, dry, austere, yes. I suppose because I was already disgusted by the amount of irrationality and wish fulfillment that there is in religion. I remember my grandma saying to me after the 1947 Harrow train crash that she had been thinking of catching that train, but God had warned her not to, and what a wonderful providence it was. And I thought, what about the people who were on the train? That kind of naive belief that the universe revolves around you and wants to secure your well-being and so on, I always hated. I wanted a drier religion. Some people used to accuse me of being almost Islamic in my liking of a very abstract, high notion of God as cosmic lawgiver rather than as personal providence.
Old Testament rather than New Testament.
Perhaps so, yes.
Although the Old Testament God liked blood as well.
Yeah, yes. I suppose I always liked the second Isaiah, the most exalted stuff about God in the Old Testament. And that emphasised that God was beyond language. You see, as I like the negative way in mysticism, that meant I wanted critical thinking, and I wanted to see religious thought as a kind of journey into darkness and unknowing, as I still do. Religion is about learning to be at ease with the void and with death, learning to accept the emptiness and mystery that surrounds our life and not be completely terrified as we mind might. All my life I've seen people who found it very difficult to bear the end of life after death. They're haunted by fear of death. I've always wanted to overcome that, and by being as dry and austere as possible, to look the truth of the human situation full in the face and say yes and accept it. So I didn't want a religion of fear, I didn't want a religion of wish fulfillment. I simply wanted to be able to look the truth in the face and survive. So my early interest in mysticism turned me towards a very, very high orthodox theology through people like Eckhart, then through people like Kant and Kierkegaard, towards a view of God as a very exalted spiritual ideal of perfection. Something like that.
And you'd reached this stage at Westcott House or after?
Not quite at Westcott. I might still have called myself sympathetic to Anglo-Catholicism and to Aquinas then a bit, I don't know. But Kant and Kierkegaard were becoming the main influences. And they still were in the 1960s, when at the time I didn't respond very warmly to John Robinson and so on. The 60s radicals didn't
honest to God.
affect me. Yes. I knew John Robinson quite well. But the 1960s radicals were not quite my cup of tea. They were too keen to humanise God, as it were. Whereas at that time I was still very high orthodox. It is often hard to reconstruct one's own thinking in retrospect. If I read one of my old books again, I'm surprised how much of my later thinking is already immanent in it. On the other hand, at the time, I wouldn't have read them that way. I wouldn't have seen things that way. It's funny how, as the years pass, some things become more salient in your thinking and some less. Your the sort of arrangement of thoughts in your head changes, evolves very mysteriously. So, although it seemed to me that my thinking has been changing radically all my life, often quite recent thoughts are already to be seen by the reader looking back in my early stuff. The whole notion of what our mental development is and how it takes place is rather mysterious to me. I just know that I write one way in one decade and another way in another decade. One changes all the time. But why one changes in the way one does, I don't know. I've called my writing a projet fleuve, and you're meant to understand the whole thing as a kind of personal story, because I don't believe that a human being will ever again be able to suppose that he caught the whole of reality in a single system of thoughts, a single metaphysical system, timelessly. Once you introduce the time dimension, once you think of everything as relative, transient, and flowing, a projet fleuve is all you can do. You can say, this is how it has seemed to me over the period from the 60s to the noughties, during which I've been writing. So my books are the only autobiography I can produce. I don't really know why I've travelled this way and want to tell this story, but this is how it's been for me. So I don't believe in metaphysics anymore, but I do believe in writing as an attempt to describe one's own journey. I've sometimes said, would anybody else like to take up my project and continue it from me as I lose the ability to continue with it? One or two people might want to try to do that. I don't know. So instead of writing traditional systematic philosophy or theology, I've done a sort of confessional engagement with my own times as a kind of spiritual autobiography, which has documented the way someone like me has changed over these generations. I'm also aware that it's one of the most violent periods of change in the whole of human history. We've grown up in all sorts of ways. Do you know a film called Hue and Cry, Ealing Studios, about 1949? Portrays a gang of 12-year-old, 14-year-old boys romping about in West London, the ruined Victorian city. When I saw that film not long ago, I thought, good God, that's my own childhood. That's the way the world was when I was that age. It's one of those kids was me. It's true. The extent to which the world has changed since the 40s, when I was a small boy in West London, is amazing.
Let's come back to this a bit.
Yeah.
You after you were at Westcott House, you were ordained, were you?
Yes, and went back to Lancashire, Salford, St Philip Salford, yes.
As a chaplain or
Assistant curate, yes.
curate.
The old Anglican system was that you could only be ordained if by becoming, if a church guaranteed to pay you for your curacy. Remember, when a bishop ordained somebody, that person became part of the bishop's familia, and the bishop was responsible for his upkeep, because the medieval church didn't want the scandal of wandering clerics. So to avoid that scandal, bishops refused to ordain people to diaconate and priesthood unless a parish, in particular the incumbent of a parish, guaranteed to pay it. So my title was St Philip with St Stephen Salford, whose rector was William Morgan. That made it possible for the bishop to ordain me. That was the system in those days. Nowadays that's rather fallen apart, because the bishops, I think rather unjustly, ordained hundreds of women without titles, many of whom never got stipendiary jobs when the ordination of women came in. But in my day you had to have a title.
How long were you assistant curate there?
I was there for 2 years, and then the offers from Cambridge started to come in. I was offered and came down to look at Trinity Hall and Corpus, as I remember. But I promised already that I would go back to Westcott House if called upon as vice principal, and I ended up by going there in the summer of '62. I was ordained deacon 50 years ago this year, in June 1959. I was the age of 25, the earliest age at which you could be ordained. I went up to curacy at St Philip's Salford, 59 to 62. In the late summer of '62, I came back to Westcott House, moved in, moved my stuff into Westcott, Westcott and began to write my lectures for the autumn term there. While at Westcott House, I taught in effect the whole syllabus of theology. The principal didn't do much lecturing. He did mainly admin and the relationship with potential bishops and vicars and so on for his people graduating from the college. But I was responsible for the bulk of the academic teaching. So I lectured on medieval church history, on the 39 Articles, on the philosophy of religion, on Christian ethics, on an amazing variety of topics. On the Old Testament I taught, and the prayer book.
Do you enjoy teaching?
Yes, it's a good teaching, is a good education. The best way to fill in gaps in your education is to be told you've got to write lectures on the subject. Also, teaching undergraduates requires you to clarify your own thinking, because you won't be a good teacher unless you get your own ideas very clear. So I enjoyed doing that, and we worked far too hard, in retrospect. The Westcott House Day started at 7 AM with meditation. Then there was Matins, then there was Eucharist, then there was breakfast with the youngsters talking animatedly throughout breakfast. 4 hours teaching to lunch, prayers just before lunch. And then there were activities in the afternoon and evening, and then something after, even some meditation and dinner, the really easy meeting. And the day lasted from 7 AM to 10 PM. That was a normal working day. And this was 7 days a week, not 5 days a week like persons in the outside world. So I got used to being a bit workaholic. After 2 years, I began to feel very lonely in the vacations and put my mind to it and married, thank heavens. But it was perhaps the difficulty of surviving in vacations single and realising that my parents had had a happy marriage and a large family. It was very queer indeed that I was still single at 27 or 8 or whatever it was now.
What was your wife's?
Well, she was
name?
Susan Day, whose brother had been a friend of mine during national service, but they lived near us in Buckinghamshire, where my parents were then living. So they were sort of family friends. Susan was a modern linguist, and she was secretary to the foreign editor of the Times. She had various jobs in London, but anyway, after we'd had dinner together one evening, it was obvious that we should marry, and we just did. Yes, she was startlingly beautiful then, quite startling, but and remained so for 30 years. But I was just lucky that she said yes. It seemed to be completely obvious actually that I was so at ease with her immediately that I knew we should marry. There was
And you
no
have children?
problem about that. Yes, we have 3 children, yes. Yes. 1 boy, 2 girls, and all doing fine, yes. In those days we were 29 and 26 on the day of marriage. And we simply started having children straight away. So they're now, well, the oldest is in his 40s now. And we married without money really. I started in Salford on £400 a year, at Westcott House on £800 a year. In 62. Then in 65 came another Cambridge college offering me a fellowship and a deanship, Emmanuel, and I accepted that and started there on 1750. We had no capital, we had no house, we lived in a house provided for us by Westcott, but we had children cheerfully, without money or very much in the way of prospects. It's curious that one did survive in those days in what would now seem to be a state of great insecurity. I would be aghast if I would be aghast if my own children were as hard up as I was when young, but we lived, it was fine.
What was, tell me about Emmanuel. It has a famous Protestant Puritan
Yes,
history.
yes. Dennis Nyman, the Regius Professor of Divinity, was a fellow of Emmanuel and also chairman of the Council of Westcott House. When the deanship at Emmanuel became vacant, Dennis somehow took it into his head that I was the right person, which really he arranged that I should be offered the Emmanuel job of fellow and dean, together with college lecturer in theology and director of studies in theology, to which was added in later years director of studies in philosophy. But this just gave me enough to live on, and even to start a mortgage, £1,700. So this was the beginnings of having enough to live on. And then when we've been at Westcott House, at Emmanuel, only 1 year, a lectureship came up in the faculty, and somehow again, to Dennis Nyman's patronage, I was lucky enough to pick up a university assistant lectureship. By that time, I was, I think, 34, but Cambridge academic teaching jobs are much fought after and competed for, so I was lucky to pick one up. Never in my life have I applied for a job, got a job. They were just sort of offered. So I date from an epoch when there were no CVs. You didn't have to sell yourself. Somehow patrons found places for you and you were offered a niche and pushed into it. It was a relic of the old patronage England, perhaps. Was it the same when you were young?
Halfway.
Halfway, yes.
Yeah.
But in my case, I was picked out, as it were, and I got my chance like that. I didn't apply for a job. And Dennis even arranged that as well as getting the assistant lectureship, I should also have the Stanton lectureship in the same year. And then, I think in the year before, the college had already appointed me to be, nominated me to be a university proctor. So it was that at the end of the 1960s, in a single year, I had 9 stipendiary jobs at Cambridge, which seems crazy, but the stipends were not large, and the stipend for being a college director of studies was about £30 a year. I remember in that year, when I was senior proctor, the stipend of the Vice-Chancellor was £400 plus a concrete block for his bicycle in the old schools with the university arms painted bodies. That was his only perquisite of his office as Vice-Chancellor. A concrete block with the university arms painted on it, just inside the gateway to the old schools. That was Eric Ashby, oh dear man. But Cambridge in those days rather assumed you had private means anyway, or didn't worry much about money, or somehow you just muddled along.
What was Emmanuel? I mean, you've been a fellow of Emmanuel ever since, and are alive
Yes,
to it. Is
yes.
it a college you feel very fond of, or?
Yes, it shot up in standing during my time. When I arrived there, it had had rather low standing. A high proportion of the undergraduates left with only ordinary degrees, not honours degrees. Some at least of the dons dated from the old pre-critical era. They still saw the university as passing on a fixed body of knowledge, mainly about the classics of Greek and Latin literature. But that's all universities were for, teaching the kids their stuff, but they were not really scholars. College's standing was pretty low, but then a series of reforming masters and senior tutors, backed by efficient bursars, began to raise the college's standards by renewing the buildings, by appointing better fellows and more of them, and by taking more pains to get really good applications to the college. And of course nowadays the college is reckoned one of the top 2 or 3 almost every year in the league tables, and it's standing as high. So I've been as a good period in Emmanuel, the best of its history, when we've had on the whole a line of particularly good senior tutors who've raised the college's status. And one of my consolations has been to have really good students to teach. even if your views mean you don't do very well at Cambridge, there is the consolation that you do get better students than they have at other universities. And that's been a great compensation.
I'm not sure whether the reference to your views is alluding to the fact that I'm not absolutely certain of the dates, but at a certain point your whole career changed, didn't it?
Yes, 1980, particularly, I think, to some extent 77, but particularly 1980, yes.
Can you tell us about?
Well, it happened by stages, I suppose. My first books appeared in about 1970, the Stanton Lectures books. 2 books arose out of that. In 73, I had a period of high mental excitement and wrote a book called The Leap of Reason, in which I discovered I could do speculative thought. And the sense of exaltation that I had during that period was so great that I knew that for the rest of my life I would try to do creative writing, creative religious thought.
What's the difference between creative religious thought and writing and what you've done before?
Well, it's rather like creative philosophy too. Thinking about new speculative ideas, thinking systematically, having new ideas. The leap of reason is still a bit Kierkegaardian. It's and now it's badly dated. I haven't reread it for many years. But it was in writing that book that I discovered I could psych myself up into such a state of mental arousal that thinking was just like rolling out a carpet and watching the pattern come into view as you pushed it out. You pushed out the carpet and you saw the pattern unfolding before you and you realised you could do anything. The sense of exaltation and power is so great when ideas are all interconnected, woven with each other, begin to come into mind. And you get a sense of mastery and joy. Which is so great that I knew that I'd have to do that. The Leap of Reason eventually appeared in 76, but then at the same time I joined a group that produced a book called The Myth of God Incarnate, which caused a bit of a scandal. This was the first book by more or less Orthodox churchmen and women, theologians, which argued that we should recognise the mythological character of the idea of incarnation. You could still, in a sense, believe in it, but you had to say this is myth rather than metaphysics. But it caused much scandal. But we survived that. But then in 1979-80, I published Taking Leave of God, and that did shut down my career, yes. That finished me so far as the academy and the church was concerned. Before it came out, I knew I'd get into trouble, but I also thought the book was sufficiently new and striking that I couldn't not publish it. I just had to, having had such ideas. Even if they get into the most awful trouble, you've got to publish it, otherwise you've wasted your life with it. So I did publish it and had to pay the price.
Did people read it? I mean, did you get comments
It sold 3,000 very fast in the first year, which for a fairly demanding book in the philosophy of religion is high, yes.
But before you published it, did you get people to read it?
No. No.
So no one said, this is going to cause you trouble?
It was originally titled The Autonomy of Religion, I think. I think John Bowden, the managing editor of the SCM Press, said that it might cause trouble, that it was a renewal of radical theology of the 60s coming back in 1980. But I wasn't particularly warned. I guessed there might be trouble, but I hadn't realised that it would be a watershed in my life, yes. It was really an ultra-Kantian book. It was only in Kant's philosophy. God survives only as an ideal of reason. Traditional metaphysical belief comes to an end. It becomes still possible to see God as an object like the pearl of great price in the parables of Jesus, a symbol of the goal of the spiritual life, a symbol of our values. But God can't be thought of as any kind of causal explanation for the existence of the world, or as a necessarily existent being. Those ideas I was giving up. So I would have said at the time, I can keep the religious value of the idea of God, I can keep its significance in the spiritual life, but I'm giving up the metaphysics and so on, because that's been taken over by science, really. Now that our sciences are historical, we can tell historical stories about how the world came into being, how life evolved, how human beings came into existence, and so on. So we don't really need that end of the idea of God, whereas we do still need the spiritual goal end of the idea of God. So I said, for me, God is still Omega, even if I can't say God is both Alpha and Omega, as it were. But the Omega is the telos, the goal of life. God still survives, on my point of view. But of course the church was outraged and wouldn't buy this at all.
Were you summoned by some senior person?
No, I was defended by the then Master of Emmanuel, Derek Brewer. Bob Ramsey, Archbishop of Canterbury, was asked about my being prosecuted for heresy in church courts and so on. He employed various people to draft replies to his letters, but his official line was that academics must be free to explore new lines of thought. And he stuck to that line. But the implication was that if a parish priest published similar ideas, he might be in dire trouble, he might lose his job, as duly happened. But Bob Ramsey and Derek Brewer did defend me, so did the then Bishop of Ely, in fact. And they said it's important to explore these lines. I found it a considerable psychological setback. I was befriended by John Robinson himself. He was then Dean of Trinity. He was thrilled that somebody had come along who was that step further on than he'd been in '63. And we had a couple of debates, and I preached twice for him. And we had public debates, some of which were published. Interestingly, although John always claimed himself to be still a realist about God, he never said I was wrong. He understood a certain ambiguity in his own language. He could be read as holding my view that for him God was only a personification of love, love with a capital L. Or he could be read in a Martin Buber sense that God was an unknown, infinite person who called upon us to see everything in a personal way. It's as if you could take an its scientific attitude to the universe, or you could respond to the whole universe with your whole self, as if the universe were a kind of super person, and you could see God as like that. Some existentialist theologies and theologies of encounter in that period took that line, and part of John Robinson was saying that. I didn't say that. I was saying we've got to give up the idea of God as a really existent super being. It doesn't make sense, it never did. I could just have defended my view on the ground that it was always Christian orthodoxy that all theological statements are analogical or symbolic. No theological statement is literally true. The mystics had always said that, even the second Isaiah had always said it. So at a pinch in the church courts, if I'd been in robust health and able to defend myself, I might just be able to defend my position as being what the Roman Catholics call dogmatic symbolism. All the propositions of dogmatic truth are symbolic. I suspect some such view is actually held by a high proportion of theologians, but I'd be more explicit than is normally thought decent. Perhaps my sin was that I'd come out too much into the open. Anyway.
When you said it had done psychological, was it a considerable psychological setback? What do you mean by that? You hadn't expected the vehemence of the...
Yes, and the extent to which one would have to pay. You have to remember that in 1976 I had got tenure as a university lectureship. I was on the professional plateau. I couldn't quite be thrown out. And happily, the the Bishop of Ely, the Master of Emmanuel, and the Archbishop of Canterbury were all friends. And they supported me in response to indignant letters calling for a trial and that kind of thing. So I could survive, but on the other hand, I was tarnished. I was a fallen angel from henceforth. I would never have quite the old respectability. The most you could hope for is that with time, the heat would simmer down. But John Robinson never recovered from honest to God. He never got another job, no preferment, nothing, you see, after honest to God.
He was a bishop, wasn't he?
Yes, already, when he published honest to God. He wasn't deprived, but he never got another episcopal, church job, and he never got another academic
And
post.
you feel...
He just got Dean of Trinity, which Dennis Diamond got him. And that was a respectable niche in which he could bat out time. But it finished him. Now, honest to God, gave a whole generation of young people the possibility of becoming Christians again. It was a great work of Anglican theology by a chap who was as Anglican as you can get. But Michael Ramsey's refusal to back it, his kowtowing to evangelicals in condemning it, meant that the radical tradition in the Church of England was really finished. In the long run, the evangelicals took over from 1963. They're now the majority in the Church of England, and there is no future for people like me. I began to realise that in 1980. The church authorities would always side with the evangelicals because they were afraid that if it came to a major trial in the church courts or the civil courts, the evangelicals would win because they were more orthodox in terms of literal adherence to the founding documents of the Church of England. Therefore, liberal theology couldn't succeed. This meant that the kind of critical thinking I believe in is in the long run incompatible with membership of the church, because the church can never accept critical thinking. The church will always in the end go for orthodoxy. Traditional orthodoxy and ways of thinking will always occupy the high ground. So the Western church will have to go the same way as the Russian church in the end. It just will. And hopes of reform and renewal for the Episcopal churches of the West have had it, I think, now. Alas, Christianity quite early on adopted to become a traditional religion with a fixed deposit of faith. So I think it's not really going to be possible either for the Roman Church or for the Anglican Church to escape from traditional orthodoxy. Perhaps the whole idea that any particular community has a hotline to truth is out of date now. Critical thinking means that identity religion, which says that just because you belong to a particular community, you have privileged access to truth, is out. We can no longer work in those terms at all. So that's why I've now, very reluctantly and sadly, just recently discontinued communion.
Have you?
I've left the communion with the church, yes, I did last October. Very painful, I hated it after 60 years. But I had to do so, I felt, again from this sort of compulsive need to strip in public that I have. I felt I had to make the break. Most of my friends stay in the church and just bat out time and don't let it be known how far they've moved from orthodoxy by the end of their lives. But they have. But I felt, in my case, I probably should. John Robinson, to some extent, tried to work his way back into respectability. I won't do that. I think it's time to admit that once you move over to a critical view of Scripture and Christian and the history of Christian doctrine, once you move over to thoroughly critical philosophy, you can no longer belong to one of the traditional scriptural religions which has a fixed framework of thought that it can never wholly leave behind. So in my most recent theology, I aligned myself a bit more with people like the Quakers and say I'm a post-ecclesiastical sort of Christian. I greatly love Christian culture and Christian ethics and Christian spirituality. I admire Jesus for his extraordinary ethical radicalism. And I'd like to imagine a new secular future for Christianity, but I don't think we can any longer hope to maintain the continuity of the Church, the apostolic succession, the transmission of truth within a community, because that idea is not tenable.
So the sea of faith is withdrawn to its outer bounds, or whatever the Victorian poet would say.
Yes.
Which leads into that famous television series. Tell me something about that. How was that related to this?
It was my third television series, yes. It came out in '84. Peter Armstrong, the producer, I had worked with on television projects before. He said, let's try to do a systematic theology. I said, I'm not really ready for it yet. And what we eventually evolved was a series of 6 television documentaries, which are historical studies of the major challenges to religious belief since Galileo. When it came out in '84, the television series came out with a large book and also a number of articles in the Listener, the BBC journal, and did quite well, and attracted a fair bit of interest. It was my single most successful book, and an enjoyable experience to do. Limited though the medium is, I don't regret having done a bit of TV, and the book still reads okay, and still sells after over 25 years. It's still in print. The evangelicals managed to stop it being broadcast at all in the USA, as you might expect. But it was published in, the television series was broadcast in Australia and New Zealand, and there gave rise to See a Faith networks there, as well as one in England. These are groups of people scattered around the country, radical Christians, some of them clergy, some lay, some still within the church, some just outside. People trying to discuss their own religious future, what they believe.
I mean, recently this whole, well, for the popular imagination, one of the great discussing points at the moment is creationism and
Yes.
work at the attack of Richard Dawkins and others
Yes.
who hold that science and religion are not compatible. Does this clash? You sort of implied that that was part of your reason for finding a great deal of religion unsatisfactory.
Not quite. So far as the biology is concerned, Dawkins is obviously right. He's obviously right to object to the irrationality of the evangelicals and the threat they present to scientific education. As they do, that kind of fundamentalism is a similar threat very often to medical research. But the controversy itself is a Victorian one, and since Nietzsche, philosophy's moved into entirely different regions, and it doesn't interest me greatly. I'm not one to get involved in it. So I'd say simply, so far as that particular argument is concerned, Dawkins is obviously right. Unlike Dawkins, I think religion continues to be interesting after you've given up belief in any supernatural world. Remember that from the time of Galileo and Descartes onwards, modern science was based on leaving out all ideas of purpose and meaning being built into the external world. So the idea that events in the world happen in accordance with the will of a personal providence that's directing us all towards a moral goal is obsolete anyway. Once the universe had become mechanized in the 17th century, the death of God was inevitable. And Darwinism only repeated the same point.
One of the things that, I mean, it's not going back exactly to what you were talking about, but the thing that really puzzles me, I mean, as an anthropologist, I know that there are many definitions of religion, and in many societies they don't involve a anthropomorphic being or anything like that. But
Yes.
the Western, as it were, religions of the book all have, as at their core, an anthropomorphic God.
Yes.
And built into the definition of religion, therefore, is that you must have a God. It still puzzles me that you can be a religious in a technical and
Yes.
formal sense without believing in any such being.
Well, I think Westerners, since the Romantic movement, have got fairly used to the idea that there can be a religious experience, for example, of the sublime in nature or of natural beauty that's not theistic. And we've known about Buddhism for a long time. But I'm surprised you find that so puzzling. Or, a number of Western philosophers like Spinoza are clearly religious in the sense that they're seeking to place the individual in the world and to help the individual find a religiously satisfactory vision of life without anything like orthodox belief in God. So it doesn't seem to me that the relation to God is part of the definition of religion at all, no. Rather, I want to know what a human being is, what I am, how my life fits into the general stream of life. I want some understanding of my place in the scheme of things, what I can know, what I can hope for, what kind of happiness a human being can enjoy, or is human life just hopelessly tragic and unable in any way to cope with the thought of death? How do we respond to the sort of vision of the world that emerges after World War II in the thought of people like Beckett and Sartre and so on, which all my life has been part of our mental landscape? So I want religion, I want the possibility of a spirituality, but without the old metaphysics. And this feeling goes back at least as far as Pascal. Notice in Pascal two things are happening. One, the external world can no longer be viewed as a world controlled by a benign divine providence. And two, we have to start from ourselves. The reconstruction of modern knowledge after the Enlightenment is entirely from the point of view of the human being who looks at the world around him without dependence on divine revelation. So it's more, the modern situation is more anthropocentric and more forces us back on our own resources. We have to find God within ourselves, perhaps, and within our own constructive activity in building our worldview and shaping our lives. Now that changeover from a vision of the world ruled by divine law to a vision of the world that comes out of the human heart, that shift which you see going on in Blake and Wordsworth, to some extent foreshadowed in Jesus himself. He also is breaking with the idea of an external law ruling human life and instead talking about a new way of living from the heart in which human relationships are put first. So I still see Jesus as a sort of pioneer of modernity and modern human situation. And that he successfully radicalized the message of the prophets, because the prophets themselves had said that at the end of time God would dwell in the human heart, the law will be written on the heart, God will put his spirit within us and so on. Some kind of internalization of religion within the individual human being was already looked forward to in the Old Testament and taken further in the New. So my new religion was much more anthropocentric, much more a matter of the individual's imagination and attempt to project meaning into life. So I nowadays talk about the religion of ordinary life, and I point out the extent to which in the last half century idioms about life have taken over in our language the place formerly occupied by idioms about God. This starts in a very big way in D.H. Lawrence and F.R. Leavis, but it can be found in earlier writers. People talk about life as if it were God. They talk about faith in life, loving life, being committed to life, learning the lessons of life, and so on. So I think nowadays, in our rather post-religious epoch, people begin to see the stream of life itself as taking the place of God. It's in life that we live and move and have our being. And you know that the line, "life is God," appears in War and Peace. There's a staggering passage in the end of War and Peace where Pierre is meditating. He says, "Life is God, and to love life is to love God. Everything moves and changes together, and that movement is God." Hegel calls it Geist, a kind of immanentizing of God within the movement of things in language and in human life, takes the place of the old objectifying kind of theology. Thou art a man, God is no more, thine own humanity learn to adore, Blake. Mercy, pity, peace and love, our God, our Father dear, Blake. So, interesting that odd pioneers in the Romantic movement are beginning to change over to a new kind of theology which is completely secular and immanent and human. And that's what I've been groping after in the last 10 years.
Or is slightly different?
It has a Christian origin, but it's kind of fulfilled Christianity, and it's post-ecclesiastical. It's no longer preparing for another world above. Rather, it's teaching us to live life to the full here below, while we've got it. So I nowadays urge people to be nihilists, to give up all ideas of supernatural world and God and life after death, and look for the possibility of fully religious existence and love of life here and now.
Some of this sounds not unfamiliar from what I know of Japanese and Chinese religion,
Yes,
Taoism and Buddhism.
that's right.
A lot of your books have been translated into Chinese.
Yes.
Do you think that's because they feel sense something in your work that...
There is something, yes, I've been much influenced by Dogen, and I used to quote him a lot at one time, yes, and some other Japanese writers too I have admired. I've also noticed the oddest things. In 1945 to 7, there was in Denmark a group of poets and theologians who wanted to articulate a new religion of life on the basis of Kierkegaard. They saw Western existentialism as culminating in a purely religious affirmation of this life and a kind of aestheticizing of life. You could see in art that aestheticizing of life beginning to appear in French Impressionism, a kind of visual joy in the transient world. All the things that Plato put lowest in value, shadows, water, trees, plants, flowers and things, are suddenly looked at with intense love because they're transient, they're moving because they're transient. I sometimes make the contrast like this. Have a look at a painting by Roger van der Veen or Van Eyck. The saints and angels are perfect, ideal, symmetrical faces, 30 years old, and they're stone dead. But look at the patron, who's at the bottom of the painting. He's old and worn and a bit overweight. He's much more beautiful and interesting. I don't want heaven anymore. I'd sooner have earth. I don't want timeless, sexless, celestial love. I'd sooner have human love, and so on. So I want an intense religious affirmation just of this life and just of transience, and that is why recently I've even gone so far as to outrage John Hitt by denying the problem of evil. I want to say yes to metaphysical evil. Another example from cinema, the film Wings of Desire, where the central character is offered the choice between being an angel and being a human being. He chooses in the end to be a human being. He'd rather have human love plus death than be immortal but sexless. It's better, actually, to be human and to die. than the alternatives that have so far been mentioned. So I want to make religion totally this worldly and irreversibly so, and given up all other dreams. And I also want to say that we actually live in our own epoch, in the first age in all human history, when ordinary people of the poorest class can have a full-length life, reasonable health, education, reasonable justice and peace and prosperity, and access to culture. No society before has achieved as much in terms of the standard of living of ordinary folk, the most ordinary folk. So it can be done. There's no reason why this life shouldn't be made a lot better. If you consider the achievements of major social reformers since World War II, and the calibre of national health service they have, for example, in France, it's a marvellous achievement to have done this for ordinary people. So I want to say to the Americans, I don't want your evangelicalism, I'd rather have our European liberal democracy and welfare state. It's far better. The church's provision of almshouses and its prayers for the sick and so on were on a pathetically small scale and completely inadequate compared with what we now can do. So I want people now to see that modern civil society is a lot more Christian than the churches, not least in its attitudes to women and to gays.
And this is the theme of one of your most recent books.
Yes, yes, I'm going on about this. You see, I want you to say there's more religious meaning around in our secular culture than it gets credit for. And that there's a very big difference between Christian culture and the others. You go to one of those cities in the Middle East and look how the state of the poor are there, and look and see what there is in the way of philanthropic provision of cultural and educational and other communities. It'll make you come running home to Christian culture and be thankful for its achievements. So I want to make people feel that the decline of ecclesiastical Christianity is not the decline of religion altogether. We've gained more than we've lost. By the way, on the decline of religion, it's often worth pointing out to people that it's already far advanced in Jane Austen. In Mansfield Park, near the beginning, there's a discussion of the decline of religion when the party of young people visit Mr. Rushmere's house at Southerton Court, and he explains to them why the chapel is no longer in use for daily prayers. So Jane Austen was well aware of the replacement of the old Anglican landowners world by the modern world. It's already begun in her time. She knows it's happening. The poor old church is very, very reluctant to admit how much things have moved on. So I no longer want to struggle for good favour with the church. I want rather to persuade people that religion is not over, and it's possible to find a way of saying yes to life which will include accepting its transience without complaint.
Most people find philosophy, particularly Kant and Hegel, well beyond them. Do you think it's possible to make philosophy accessible to ordinary people?
Yes, I have wanted to try to democratize both philosophy and theology. Philosophy for this reason. Historically, philosophy was a very elite subject. From Plato to Nietzsche, it was elite. But today, with mass higher education, we're actually teaching philosophy to a mass audience far bigger than the great figures of the past could ever have imagined. We want a more democratic philosophy and a more democratic theology. Theology in the past was written for church leaders, and it was church ideology, it was an ideology of power, an ideology of ecclesiastical power in particular. So I've tried instead to base my religious language on ordinary language. I wrote a book called The New Religion of Life in Everyday Speech, in which I listed 150 or so of the most important new idioms about life that have come in since World War II. and I plotted those idioms against the traditional doctrine of God to show to what extent we've transferred the religious focus from God to life, ordinary life. An obvious example is the way in which the funeral service in modern England is nearly always the closure of a life and is not about another life after death anymore at all. In philosophy, I've tried to say that we can be content with the worldview that is the product of our ordinary everyday human conversation with each other, a conversation in which we all take part. I give one example of this. In ordinary language, we've come to use the word perception to mean interpretation in the last 20 years. When we talk about the difference between one person's perception of an issue and another's, perception means interpretation. So it's not only the philosophers who are no longer such blank slate empiricists as they used to be, ordinary people have got the message too. So I've rather specialised in my recent books in putting into bold type little phrases taken from ordinary language that make quite sophisticated philosophical points. And I claim that my current philosophy of life and religion of life is in fact what's already emerging in ordinary language. So I say to the reader, don't suppose that I'm trying to foist my hereditary ideas upon you. I'm trying to show you what you already think, what already shows up in your own language. So that way I'm trying to make philosophy and theology more democratic subjects which will be accessible to ordinary people.